Hello, this is Martin Carkson. I'm a communication studies professor at Colorado State University and the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. This is going to be a series of 3 introductory videos broadly to the concept of wicked problems and deliberative engagement. It's going to engage some pretty big questions. Questions like, why are we so polarized and outraged? How can we reframe things? How can we kind of shift our conversations away from that polarization? And then long-term, how can we build capacity in our communities to have the kind of conversations we need to have for democracy to work and for us to take on our shared problems more productively? So if you look on YouTube, on the first comments, I created a resource page, which is going to kind of follow along the presentation, give you lots of different links to different resources and papers and videos and those type of things about the things I'm talking about. Also has my email on there, so feel free to email me if you got questions. I'll add to that document. You also get a chance if you'd like to kind of give me your name, and then I'll just kind of shoot you an email when I update things, because I'm going to have the initial set of 3 videos, which kind of installs the basic ideas. But then I'm going to do additional videos afterwards, digging in a lot more into some of the specific things kind of mentioned on there. Some of those I have ready, some of those I'll develop, and some of those I'll develop based on interest as I kind of go through. But first, I'll introduce myself a little bit more fully. Basically, my research for the last 20 years has been, how do we talk about tough issues? How do we come together across perspective to kind of work on our most difficult problems? My early academic kind of training was in what's called argumentation, which is a subfield that really focuses on how do people make arguments? How do people back up their positions? A lot of academic work in there in terms of logic and fallacies and credibility and quality of the source, but also really looking at the power of stories and narratives, the power of emotions, and the power of values. And that's really kind of one of the things I've focused a lot, and you'll hear a lot about in these videos, is how people use values to talk about certain issues, to talk about their policy preferences. Unfortunately, how people use values to divide us and to frame things in very simple ways that lead to polarization, but also potentially how people can use values to improve conversations and to actually help us come together and tap into some of the best of human nature as we kind of go through. My early work was national politics. I got more and more frustrated commenting on national politics, and you'll see why as we kind of go through here. So when I got to CSU about 20 years ago, I shifted my focus from national to local, and I also shifted from being more of a critic, an academic, commenting on other people's communication, to much more of a practitioner. So what I did with the CBD serves as an impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. Me and my colleagues train undergraduate and graduate students as facilitators, and then we design and run innovative events in the local community, running events for the city, for the county, for school districts, for community organizations, all based on the ideas that you'll be hearing in these 3 videos, that democracy requires pretty high quality communication. We have to be able to talk about some of these issues, and unfortunately, we're not really wired for that. So we have to kind of be proactive, and you have to use quality process design to avoid triggering the worst of human nature that I'll get into a lot in the second video, and ideally get into the best of human nature, which I'll get into in the third video. Part of the overall argument of this is, I do argue that I do think this polarization and this division is pretty much the #1 issue that we're dealing with in our country. And the reason I say that is because if we don't take that on, we're not going to be able to take on any of the other issues that people care about. All the bigger kind of tough issues get undermined because we can't have the conversations, we can't engage each other. Bad arguments are incentivized, good arguments are punished so much when we're polarized. We'll look a lot in video too in social psychology and brain science. And when we're situated as adversaries, as enemies, our brains kind of shut down. So my argument is we first need to take on polarization, particularly in our local communities, build up a culture that gets away from that. Then we can really start taking on some much bigger issues. And if we're able to move the needle on polarization, I think it's going to make it that much more productive to be able to move the needle on a whole range of issues that we all care about. So I'm going to start my screen here. So the overall title of this presentation is called Wicked Problems, White Cities, which is going to hopefully be the title of my book that should be out hopefully at some point in the next years or so. You got my contact information there. That's the link, which I also put into YouTube to the resource document that will give you a lot of other additional links to the concepts I'll talk about. It's a pretty big slide deck. I'll go pretty fast through some of these. Really encourage you at any time, if you feel like, pause and read kind of the more specifics. That link also has all the PDF to all the slides as well. Right. But as I mentioned, overall, I'm going to cover kind of three big topics. Go back a second. This first video is going to focus on this basic reality of wicked problems, of a framework that I developed building off other research on wicked problems as a particularly kind of useful, particularly pragmatic way of framing issues that I think will help us have these much better conversations, help us avoid the worst of polarization. Right? The second video is going to get into the bad news. It's going to dive into social psychology and brain science and really kind of help us really understand how our brains work. Unfortunately, our brains are not wired for deliberation. They're much more wired for polarization. And then on top of that, many of our processes, the framework of our political system, unfortunately, the incentives for our media actually play into that, right? And they're rewarded by kind of tapping into the worst of human nature. So we spent a lot of time there. It really makes understand how our brains work. So that really sets up the third argument of once we understand these first two, then we can start making the changes, particularly at the local level, to change the conversation, to stop triggering the worst of human nature, to start tapping into the best of human nature and elevate our conversations and be able to take on the issues that we really care about, right? This is one of the slides. Obviously, this can't be interactive. It's just recorded. But when I'm giving talks, I use this slide to begin with often, kind of interaction, asking people, hey, which of these words or statements really kind of fits your perspective of the quality of public discourse right now? As you can see, there's a mix of positive and negative terms. And every single time I've ever asked this, all the negative terms get picked before any of the positive ones. I've actually been in the room sometimes with quite a few people that none of the positive terms make the top three. Here we have a few of them. Now, this really lays out the goal of my work, right? How do we change this? We have a lot of work to do. Right? And part of what we'll kind of talk about is I see this as almost a two-step process. There's certain things that you can do to avoid kind of incentivizing some of these negative things. And unfortunately, a lot of our current public process, the conventional means of engaging the public, tend to bring out these negative things. The next step is replacing those bad processes with much more productive processes, deliberative processes. And then now you're not only not getting the negative terms, now you're getting some of the positive terms, well, high quality engagement, productive engagement that actually brings people together. This slide just kind of shows some of the projects that we've worked on. I can tell you every single one of these bullet points, and there's probably twice as many that I could put on there. The font keeps on getting smaller and smaller on this slide. Was the community coming to us? Right. Coming to one of our meetings, seeing us engage an issue in a different way, sparking different conversation, and coming up to me afterwards saying, hey, can we do this on this? Right. So I show this slide for two reasons. One, for optimism, right? It's going to be a little bit of a roller coaster, a lot of bad news and some good news in this presentation. But I do truly believe that people are starving for genuine engagement. They want authentic conversations. They're looking for something different. They're sick of just yelling at each other and talking past each other and assuming half the country is evil or harming the country. Second reason I put this on here is just to kind of make the point that the concepts, the theory that I'll be covering in these videos are not from top down. They're not from academic book. They are from practice. They are from running events for the last 16 years. We've run over 500 events at the CPD over the last 16 years. And learning from that, it's a constant kind of experiment, kind of developing kind of as we go. So this is a picture of one of our events. What we're able to do, I've got about 30 or 35 students that are trained as facilitators each semester that are getting class credit. So when 100 people show up to talk about an issue, instead of those 100 people listening to an expert on the stage or walking up to that microphone one at a time to talk past each other, which is horrible process designed for complex issues, we can split them up into 15 different tables, each table with one of my students, typically two, a note taker and a facilitator, generally trained in conflict management and deliberative processes, but also specifically trained in that event. We create a unique kind of process design for each event, drawing on several principles to help people, again, have this tough conversation to really engage the issue in a different way. Right? So we're going to go ahead and jump in on that first kind of argument, this basic reality about wicked problems. And there's a whole literature on wicked problems. I'll put a couple of links into the resource guide. I will say that I do it a little bit differently than most. A lot of the research, wicked problems, is kind of a category or a type of problem. Maybe there's a simple problem, complex, and then wicked. I use it more in terms of like a lens through which to see problems. It's like a tool in your toolkit that you can step back when you want to and say, hey, if we look at this as a wicked problem, how does that change things? How does that change the conversation? How might that open up space for different ways of thinking about this? Right? You see my definition here. Generally, what a wicked problem is, it's a problem that inherently involves multiple competing underlying values that have inherent paradoxes or tensions or trade-offs to them. That there's not can't be resolved by science is the notion that there's not a solution. There's not a technical like we can figure this out and we apply a solution. The problem's gone. Wicked problems are always going to be with us because they're inherently value laden. And the best we can do is kind of find the best way to kind of manage these tensions and navigate these kind of inherent paradoxes in there to spark better quality of life and have community more like we wanted to see. But best way to talk about wicked problems is with an example. So I'll dig into this one a lot and then I'll show you quite a few others. But this is an example of what I call a wicked problem slide. It's one of the key tools we use at the CPD, sometimes just internally to understand an issue, and then sometimes specifically using them during our public process meetings. But the basic idea here is researching the issue for a while. A lot of my work is kind of making sense of the noise, diving into the public discourse, watching the one time on the microphone at city council, diving into message boards in the newspaper, interviewing or going to different websites of different kind of activist groups to really try to understand how they're talking about the issue. And I try to capture it, sometimes in one slide of what are the things people care about? What's important to people when they're making the arguments? Right? So here, this is a wicked problem in a couple different ways. So one is if you look at these 9 things that people care about, these are all good things. Right? They're framed purposely in terms of reasonable people could care about these things. I'm not saying they're all equally important, and that's part of the issue. We have to decide, and different people would rank these differently. But so first aspect, there's lots of good things that people care about on this issue, and what really makes it wicked is those good things don't fit together very well. And the more we focus on some of these, the harder it is to focus on others. Some of them fit pretty well. Others have much kind of tougher tensions in there, maybe not quite a zero-sum game in a way, but they really don't fit together very well. And the reality is the conversation we need to be having about this issue is about how do we negotiate these tensions? How do we figure out the right way to kind of deal with this? But we don't have that conversation naturally. As we'll get into a lot in the second video, our brains aren't wired for tensions and paradoxes. Our brains want simple. Our brains want one value at our time. Our brains want to think about, I care about something important, and anyone who disagrees with me is rejecting that important thing. Our brains love to define the people that we're against by what they're against, right? Instead of considering really what they're for. So what we try to do in our work is spark 3 very different conversations that unfortunately don't happen naturally. You have to be proactive to create capacity and spark these kind of conversations. But the long-term conversation is a balancing one. Since there isn't a technical solution to wicked problems, again, you're not going to, it's not going to be a linear process that ends the problem. You can certainly have better or worse treatments to the problem, better ways of balancing. So long-term, we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the right balance between these different values? In the short term, it's called a recalibrating conversation. You might have a significant shift. You might realize that one value has been dominating too much, or one value has been left behind, or maybe a new value has jumped in that we need to consider and think about. So recalibrating brings in activism, brings in people can have strong opinions about values. We just work for people to have that conversation about values within a broad range of values. I always avoid framing things as if only one value is relevant. I know from the beginning if that's what's being done, then it's going to be a bad conversation that's going to polarize and that's going to undermine our ability as a community to address that issue productively. And the third one, the transcending conversation, is a short-term ideal. This is, we'll get into it in video 3, tapping into the best of human nature. The best of human nature is that we're creative, right? That we're imaginative, that we can innovate. So sometimes when you actually recognize the tension and instead of just talking past each other, you try to find the win-win. You try to find, hey, how can we bring these two things together? Not always possible, but often it is in important ways. And I'll show you a couple examples of those a little later. But unfortunately, again, we don't tend to naturally have the balancing, the recalibrating, the transcending conversation if we have the much simpler one available to us, which is I've got a good value and those who disagree with me have bad values. Right? And this is really the heart of the wicked problems kind of metaphor, right? we want to assume problems are caused by wicked people, bad people with bad values. This framework pokes the weakness in the problem and sees how does the conversation change if we assume the wickedness is the problem rather than the people. Right? So I'm going to go fast through these just to cover a few other quick examples, but the same basic concept that individually one at a time, these are all good things. They just don't fit together very well. And there's natural tensions between them that we have to kind of struggle with. So this one we developed in Routt County in Western Colorado. The healthcare in some ways is very complex, but in other ways we want three things, and those three things don't fit together very well. And that's why it's a constant struggle and a wicked problem for us to kind of figure out. This one we developed, this is one of the ones that we actually used in a process specifically, had a big survey about downtown Fort Collins, what people wanted out of it, analyzed that, brought out the underlying values, reported it back to them, and then had a really kind of productive conversation asking people at tables, hey, which of these are most important to you? Which of these we want to push back on, and listening to each other, and then hopefully, again, sparking that, okay, how do we find the right balance between these? How might we need to recalibrate what we're doing right now? And how can we potentially kind of transcend these in some interesting ways? We were asked by the university to help with parking. My initial thought, this seemed like a very technical problem, just get an expert. But they had done that. They got a report. There's a lot of pushback on the suggestions the expert made. So we went to do a kind of public process. Often what I do is I start with a survey. I want a collection of individual opinions first so I can understand what people care about. And often want to ask open-ended questions because I want to see people's arguments. I want to see people, why they hold an opinion, not just what their opinion is. And certainly as we started digging into that, all these values kind of came out. We realized how complex parking is on a campus as you're thinking about it. This is an interesting case. We ran a series of workshops or public events for the Platte River Power Authority, which is the power provider for 4 cities here in northern Colorado, including Fort Collins. But when it first came in, they showed me on the bottom left, you can kind of see their mission, but their mission is framed as, hey, their job is to safely provide reliable, environmentally responsible, and financially sustainable energy. Their mission statement essentially lays out a wicked problem. They care about those 3 things. But unfortunately, those 3 things don't fit together very well. Right? So the whole process we designed for them is, hey, how do we honor these 3 things, recognizing the tension? How do we prioritize them? How do we hopefully find ways of kind of transcending them in some way, in some important ways? Right? This is another kind of important one, that the concept of sustainability. Fort Collins is known as a triple bottom line city. They have a sustainability director, and then under her, there's an economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. The whole concept of the triple bottom line was actually developed by environmental activists. And in the 70s or so, it was the economy versus the environment. And it was kind of all-out war, adversarial kind of process. And a subgroup of environmentalists realized if we just kind of keep it at this adversarial process, we're going to lose because they have a lot more money and a lot more power. So they sought to reframe it. And instead of demonizing profit, instead of demonizing business or development, they said, okay, well, that's important, right? Economic vitality is important, but we also care about people and we also care about the planet. Right? So once again, each one individually is a good thing. They just don't fit together very well. But instead of framing things strategically as if there is no tension, you lean into the tension and say, hey, we care about these 3 things. They don't fit together. How can we work together to find the right balance, to potentially recalibrate and to potentially transcend? This is the best example of transcendence. In reality, a well-paying green job is good for the person, it's good for the planet, and it's good for the environment, right? And all of a sudden, traditional adversaries who are doing everything to undermine each other are working together to kind of build up this new kind of transcendent option. Right? This is the last of these, in a sense, obviously a new one that I developed thinking about response to COVID. I would argue COVID itself isn't a wicked problem, right? It is a technical problem, a scientific problem that we do have vaccines now. But how communities respond to COVID got wicked really quick, right? The difference between this one with all the other ones is you'll notice that public health is centered on the screen and in a larger font. I'm making an argument inherently already of prioritizing public health, right? Of saying, recalibrating and saying, hey, right now public health has to be our number 1 priority. That being said, we recognize the importance of these other values. We don't frame it as you're either for public health or against it, right? And people that express the values around here shouldn't be ridiculed, right? But they should also be part of the conversation that recognize that public health has to be prioritized for us to kind of move forward as a community, kind of deal with this crisis situation. Right? So the last example that I'll give is, pulled from the preamble of the Constitution, embedded in the preamble are some pretty big values. If we translate those values into a little bit more modern terms, here are kind of 5 big kind of American values. And the argument here is American values themselves. Democracy itself is a wicked problem. The same exact kind of setup. Taken individually, these are all good things, but they don't fit together very well. And they, so these inherent tensions require us to kind of make some tough choices. One of the things I do when I give my talks is, I ask people after I introduce those 5, say, hey, which of these is most important to you? And I recognize if I ask people to define them, we would get 100 different definitions, right? But for what the word means to you, if you had to pick one to be more important than the other 4, what would it be? And this is a very typical example. Which one's highest always kind of depends in different kind of groups. But in almost every case I've done this with more than 15 people in the room, every single value got picked by at least somebody, right? Which shows, hey, we all agree on the values, right? But we rank them differently. And that's kind of the idea. Part of the argument of wicked problems kind of perspective is, in many ways, we all have the same values. We just rank them differently, and those differences have some pretty good consequences in terms of what we would support, right? The second question I ask, a little bit more difficult, is which of these is the least important to you? Which one are you most willing to kind of give up, right? This always sparks a lot of conversation, a lot of nervousness. That takes a lot longer. Lots of people don't vote on this, right? And they're not saying they don't care about that. The situation's set up that, hey, which of these would be on the bottom if you had to kind of, pick one, right? And so it creates a situation that we realize in that room that there's quite a few people that their number one value is someone else's bottom value. That means there's a lot of conflict or not, right? Because again, most of them would agree that they're all positive values if you just take them one at a time. Right? So that's the reality of so many of our issues. Most people are reasonable and have positive values for what they're thinking about. It's just how it's connected and how are they making sense of the issue in a way. But you just take those 5 values, there's some pretty big inherent tensions there that we don't naturally talk about. We talk about freedom and equality all the time, but we rarely talk about the inherent tension between freedom and equality. And at least in an economic system, the more freedom we have, the more inequality we tend to have. The rich tend to get richer and the poor get poor, right? If we want equality, we have to violate freedom. And then now we're talking more and more about equity and the difference between equity and equality, which is a whole nother conversation that we really need to dig into, because these are powerful terms that really kind of touch so many different kind of issues. And how do we define these terms? What do we mean by them? And how do we struggle with the tensions between them is an inherent part of living in a diverse democracy that we need to learn how to do better, right? Our freedom versus freedom of future generations tension. Freedom and security is a tension most people know pretty well. We deal with that every time we try to travel at the airport. And then justice is a special case. Kind of goes back to Aristotle. I'll have a separate video that digs into this a little bit more with the concept of polarity management. But one way to think about justice is, instead, you don't maximize justice. Justice is a tension within itself. Justice is getting exactly what you deserve, whether that's reward or punishment, no more, no less. So there's a danger of the extremes on either side of it. And then similarly, these are just some of the other tensions. I won't walk through these, so pause and look through if you like. But inherently, as I start a new project and start having conversations with people, what I'm looking for in my brain is, what are the inherent tensions to this issue that we really need to be engaging? That in most cases we're avoiding it, right? Our brains inherently want to avoid it, or strategic kind of pundits are framing things purposely as if there is no tension. And that's big part of why we struggle having these conversations. Right? So the end of this kind of part, dealing with wicked problems well require really high quality communication, creativity to tap into that potential transcendence, innovation, bringing kind of values together, and collaborative action, working across perspectives. And you go back to the initial slide I had of what terms people use to describe the quality of public discourse. All the negative ones dominated. We're not getting what we need. Right? So the long-term project, particularly on a local community, is how do we start changing how we talk about issues, building capacity so we can have the communication, the creativity, and collaborative action we need to be able to take on wicked problems much more productively. Right? So that's the end of video 1. Video 2, we'll jump into the bad news to dig into the social psychology of brain science, why, how we're wired, which helps us understand why the conversations are so bad, but then also sets us up for the third video of, okay, so then how can we use process design to avoid triggering the worst of human nature, to tap into the best of human nature to take on our wicked problems? Thank you. Thank you.